Dude, this is the dawn of renewable energy. How does that sound? Does that excite you?
Us as an industry need as many talented people as possible.
Yep.
We're very understaffed as an industry. And we've talked often, like, how do we, for the future of our industry, what can we do to help with that? It's tough.
All right, welcome to another fabulous edition of the Sounds of Solar podcast. I'm your host, Christoph Brun, joined by some esteemed colleagues of mine.
Russell Hamilton.
Prahlad Shivshankar here.
Wonderful. Guys, this is the first time the three of us have sat in the same room in like 2 months. How does it feel?
Awesome.
Speechless. Speechless.
Feels good.
Yeah.
It feels natural.
We have a great guest today, Michael Klein from EE North America. Michael, how are you? And thanks for joining us on the Sounds of Solar.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's been pretty good so far. I flew in last night. I love Minneapolis, one of my favorite cities in the country. Mm-hmm. I've always said it's kind of like Portland of the Midwest. And so, you know, living in Austin, it's a very similar vibe to Austin in many ways, kind of laid back, great city. And yeah, just really happy to be here.
Man, he sold it better than we could. Can you give us a high-level overview of what you're doing now and what your involvement is at EE North America?
Yeah, absolutely. So at EE North America, I'm the head of project development. What that role really entails for us is just about everything except finance. I have a great partner in crime, Alexander, and he is our head of project finance within our group. And then our CEO, Lorena Cicerello, she's our CEO of North America. Between the three of us, between Lorena handling strategy and finance, Alex doing more finance day-to-day, and then myself handling more of the project development, engineering, procurement, and construction part of our business. We're really a strong trio within our group. And kind of my day-to-day really is solving problems on projects, really trying to guide the projects in a way that we can get them to ready to build or NTP and being sure that they're done at, you know, the highest quality possible. And that's really what we're focused on, is not the quantity of projects or pushing projects through our pipeline, but focusing on making every one of our projects the best that it possibly can be, especially because we're very diverse on the generation side of our business between wind, solar, and storage. And then on the load side of our business, where we're heavily focused on green hydrogen and the power to X part of our business, especially because of our European roots. The EE in EE North America is for European Energy. We're a subsidiary of a large Danish IPP called European Energy that's based in Denmark. They have about 65 gigawatts worth of project in their pipeline, from development to construction to operations, and they're actually finishing the world's largest green e-methanol facility in Denmark right now called Kaso. It should be finished, I think, June or July of this year, and that facility will be about 300,000 or 30,000 metric tons of e-methanol. So, and it's powered by basically a wind and a solar project on the back end. So yeah, we're doing a lot of exciting stuff within EE North America. A lot of exciting things we're bringing to the States, and yeah, just really happy to be on this journey with the entire team. So, and our great partners at EVS are right there along with us to help us bring those projects to life over time.
There you go. Thanks for the nod.
I was going to ask, you're saying, you know, quality of projects over quantity of projects. How many projects in a typical year are you heading up?
Yeah, so in a typical year, we're probably looking at anywhere between, I'd say, 15 to 20 projects. And so for a small team, that's a lot of projects to manage. I think what we've thought about, though, is not trying to be the subject matter experts in any one of our projects, and really building this system around developing the project so that we can plug in our great partners to help us along the way. One of the things that I've done in my role for the first 18 months is really breaking the projects down into modular units so they're easier to execute, right? I think a lot of project developers want to get to the solution as quickly as possible, and maybe they're not always focused on how do I execute the plan into smaller steps so that we can execute it as quickly and easily as possible along the way. And so, you know, that's been a lot of my work, is trying to break it into smaller steps for everyone to get it across the finish line in a more efficient manner.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense, because these projects are, there's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars at stake potentially, mm-hmm. and they're extremely complex. Like,
oh yeah,
I think that's one of the things that I learned joining solar was, you know, you look at a solar installation and it looks relatively simple. Like, like, oh, there's the panels, they're tilting. Okay. But the amount of engineering and development, like from your world, like that goes into it is just, it's insane. It really is.
Yeah. And I think too, like if you look at just construction projects as a whole, I'm going to do a plug for a book really quick, How Big Things Are Done. It's a book that I read a few years ago, and it's kind of really influenced a lot of the work that I've done in my field. One of the things that book talks about a lot of is breaking things down and making them as modular as possible. So for example, you look at a traditional large infrastructure project like a public transportation project, right? A lot of those projects are, hey, we have this ultimate goal of, let's say, building a light rail system, but they don't always do all of the planning and the setup work to get you there. And, from budgetary constraints to technical constraints, people are just, hey, go, 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 act fast, get the project done. And then it veers off for schedule, budget, for whatever reason. Solar and wind is kind of unique compared to a lot of other capital projects because you can really break those projects down into minor steps. And I think a lot of people have heard the assembly line analogy with solar construction and wind construction. But that's why there's a lot less variance within a solar or wind project, is because you can break those steps down into smaller and smaller pieces.
One of the buzzwords that you're using is power to X. I think I've heard solar, I've heard wind. What is power to X that you were talking about?
That is a great buzzword. It's the buzziest buzzword, I think, in our industry outside of probably hydrogen. And
we'll get to hydrogen.
Yeah, we'll get to hydrogen. So I think power to X for me, the easiest way to describe it is taking any form of energy, electricity, and transforming it into something else, right? So for example, taking biomass, right? Biomass is a perfect example. You take biomass, you put that into a boiler, you create a steam loop, have a steam turbine run it, create electricity, but then you have byproduct from a biomass facility in the form of like CO2. And so CO2, you can use that in other products elsewhere in the value chain. And so for me, power to X is really, you're taking any form of electricity and you're transforming it into something else. I think how a lot of people use it and how we use it within our company more specifically is especially around hydrogen and hydrogen production. And so a lot of our work within our company is focused on green electricity, solar and wind, putting that into an electrolyzer like a PEM electrolyzer, and then taking water as an input, splitting that into oxygen and hydrogen. And then what can you use with the oxygen and what can you use with the hydrogen? And so I think that's what a lot of developers are also working on in the United States as well. There's at least, I'd say 10 firms that are really serious about that work right now. And we're all, working towards the same goal of executing the goals of the IRA and trying to decarbonize those really hard to abate industries. But I'm probably getting way ahead of myself to talk about the subject.
So before we get there, I want to go back just a hair.
Yeah.
So everything you've said so far, you have a wealth of knowledge in renewables, but why did you get into renewables? What's your background prior to where we are right now?
So before I got into renewables, I grew up in a family of engineers. So my father was an engineering consultant for many years in the pulp and paper industry. My mother worked in his business as well. And so I was always around engineering, especially industrial engineering. So even as a kid, I remember going to hydroelectric dams in upstate New York, and he would show me like, hey, this is how a turbine works in a hydroelectric dam. This is how, pulp and paper mill works with all of the wood coming in and pulpifying it. And here's the finished product. And so like walking around those big industrial facilities always amazed me as a kid. So that's how I initially kind of grew up in the industry. Specifically renewables, I think I had a little bit of a different path than probably most. I actually started in land development, so civil land development engineering. So typical survey, residential, subdivisions, commercial areas, and kind of worked my way up through that industry to start. I think that industry is really great for the right type of person. I'm not sure if I'm that type of person to be doing plats and survey work and all that type of stuff all the time. And so when I was getting out of college,
And what did you go to college for?
Civil structural
Okay, it
engineering.
was civil. Okay,
Yeah, so civil structural.
my boy.
Yeah, I love structural. It's funny. One of my favorite questions in interviews, and if anyone who's ever interviewed with me is listening to this, they'll know this. I will always ask them, what is the type of beam that is used for the racking systems on a solar project?
I know this. I know.
All right,
this.
Chris,
I know
what
this.
is it?
Well, what about these guys?
I-beam.
Come on.
H-beam.
No. Come on, Chris, you know this.
Wide flange. Wide flange.
We fail.
It should be easier than that.
guys-
We fail. We're electricals. What do we?
That's fair.
They are. You guys operate in a world of imaginary things.
You're not wrong.
So back to the original point of how I got into the industry. Starting land development, and oddly, land development has a lot of similar skills to just traditional's renewable development, right? Understanding permitting processes, understanding your environmental constraints on a project, just understanding the local zoning codes of a local municipality. Where do you find that information, right? Like a lot of that land development work that I did early in my career really helped me much later in my career. But that being said, I was in CAD every day. I was doing plans. I kind of was like, I'm not sure if I want to do this the rest of my life. And so that's how I ended up in renewables. Is I ended up working for a large engineering and construction company called Wood, which went through a bunch of different mergers, but it started as AMEC Foster Wheeler. AMEC, it's before that. Now it's Wood. And so I worked for Wood for many, many years, building projects all over the United States. And a lot of the guys that I worked with since then are either still at Wood or split off and they're doing their own thing. But I'd say this, the team that we had at Wood at the time really taught me about teamwork and being in it together and working towards a common goal. And one of the things I loved about my time working in the field, especially as a project engineer and a field engineer, was it was never one person's responsibility to get anything done on a job site. It was always everyone's responsibility. And so working in an environment like that, you learn really quickly that everyone's responsible for the success of a project. And if we all do right by the project, we're all going to succeed.
This is like, what's the movie? It's like a NASA movie, but the whole thing is the
Apollo 13?
I was just saying Apollo 13.
Yeah, and it's like because of me, this will not fail. This is the kind of the famous quote from it. Basically, yeah, we're all going to make it work together,
Right.
Because, well, the sum of our parts is
much greater than
Exactly.
one of us.
Yeah.
And especially on a job site where you have time constraints, budget constraints, efficiency constraints, labor constraints, material constraints, right? You really have to have a really good plan in place to execute a project. I mean, one of my earliest memories working for Wood was I was kind of fresh out of college. They had moved me to Atlanta for a bit, and we literally spent almost 4 months planning a project, getting it ready for engineering, putting all the pieces together before we even mobilized to the field, right? And doing that kind of work taught me, like, you got to plan projects out. You can't just kind of swing from the hip and say, hey, or shoot from the hip and say, hey, yeah, we just got to get this done. Like that's not how you succeed with a project. It's really proper planning. So yeah, worked for Wood for many years. Great team over there, great management. A lot of those folks that were part of that group at the time have all split off and done very successful ventures in other areas in renewables. And then I joined a large developer for a few years, kind of as like a project manager of EPC. And I think my biggest takeaway from my experience there was understanding the different parts of the business, right? When you work for an EPC, EPCs typically see, hey, we have the project site, it's already been developed, it's already been permitted. You figure out how to build it the most efficient way possible. When you work for a developer, you have to see all of the different aspects of a project, right? How is the permitting done? How does that feed into your EPC work? How does that feed into asset owner management and O&M? And how do you make those decisions, right? How do you evaluate, for example, installing cab on a project that has a next tracker and then you have a cab line right in the middle of the row? And how does that affect your O&M cost and your mowing costs and everything else? So, working for a developer, it really gives you a different view of how projects come together because it's very multidisciplinary, right? Even more than typically engineering, right? Engineering, you have electrical, you have civil structural, you have survey, you have geotech, and maybe you have SCADA, right? And you have your controls team. That's like 5 disciplines, but that's all within the broader scope of engineering. When you work for a developer, you have infinitely more different disciplines you're working with to bring a project together. And how you approach those disciplines, really, you have to really think about that and how you communicate with those different types of folk to communicate the same type of information. So that was really my biggest skill set that I brought from working for that developer, was understanding that it's all different types of people you're working with on any given basis. Also say that working for a developer, you are so focused on getting the projects done and getting as much of the different disciplines together, you pick up a lot of those different skill sets along the way. And so in my career, I think the biggest advantage in my entire career, if I had one thing to give to anyone that's young looking to get into clean tech or get into renewables, is think about skill stacking. And what I mean by that is you don't have to be the greatest structural engineer or the greatest electrical engineer or the greatest developer or, any of that. You need to figure out a way to be above average in maybe some of those skills, and then find another skill to add on top of that. And then continue to add skills on top of that until you can see the entire playing field. So when you are working with a different firm or a different group, you can really understand everything that's going on. And I think that's, what's helped me the most in my career, is just saying, oh, that's kind of interesting. Let me investigate more. Let me get really good at that. And then add it on top of what I was already good at.
We're very understaffed as an industry. And we've talked often, like, how do we, for the future of our industry, what can we do to help with that? It's tough. We've thought about sponsoring colleges in the local area for solar development, like solar engineering specific,
right?
Just something to get people excited about this industry. There's a huge amount of, let's just say, oil and gas engineers who've done it for 50 years or 30 years that are struggling to transition to this renewable industry.
Yeah.
So we don't have that well of
talent.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's at all parts of the industry too. It's not just with the engineers, from development to asset management to O&M to even just environmental people, right? Think about how many environmental scientists are out there that are really good at what they do. It's a really limited pool. And when you're competing against not only the other folks in our industry, but then you have residential guys that are trying to do subdivisions, or you have industrial guys that are trying to do natural gas combined cycle power plants, right? There's a lot of work out there for a lot of folks right now.
Yeah.
And so how do we make our industry the most enticing possible?
Yes.
And I've always come back to the same point on this, is we have probably the best people in industry. I have not worked in any other industry that has so many good-hearted.
I have a theory why, but I'll share it.
Okay.
Well, we're all transplants. It's like the West Coast.
That's fair. Yeah.
Everyone here left their old industry wanting to probably be here because it's renewables. I don't understand how that is not the main selling point. I talk to my old colleagues in traditional building structures. Those guys and gals, they're just sitting at their desk waiting for 30 years to pass. Like they are clocking in and clocking out. Their work is a mindset, turn your brain off. Like maybe, obviously I'm not speaking for everyone, but that's what I observed. And I knew that I had a much higher potential than that. And it was like, I want to do something that actually matters. So like to hear people who want to just like do, especially in the old civil structural world, like that has been around since the Romans. Renewables has been around, 10 years in like any sort of appreciable capacity?
Yeah, I'd say 20, but 10 to 20.
But like, and then the last 5 has been like
a rocket ship.
Exactly. And it's like, you guys, like this is what I tell people when they, like, we just had a new SCPM start. I'm like, dude, this is the dawn of renewable energy. How does that sound? Like, does that excite you? Because it wasn't the dawn of apartment building construction where you previously were at and where I was previously at. Like, we've been doing that. We did that. We figured it out. Why not try something? And like, So anyway,
and that's how I feel.
Very bad.
Well, no, that's how I felt when I joined the industry too, Chris. Right? Like you're doing something that matters. Right?
Exactly. That's why we work.
You're doing projects that really matter and really change people's lives, and not only on a local scale. Right? You do a really good apartment building, you probably change the lives of 10, 20, 30
not to discount
people.
that.
But no, you're improving people's lives, especially the cities that we live in and we're in every day, right? That's a really honorable job to do. I would also say, though, that waking up every morning and producing the cleanest electricity that the world has ever known, plus having an impact on climate change, on top of producing the lowest cost electricity in the world, tell me an industry that's doing that, hitting all of those goals and providing so much value to not only the little local community that they're around, from jobs to economic development to bringing people with training for skills, right? Like, that's something I feel like gets missed all the time, is all the skills that we're training people in, from construction to engineering to procurement to management to development. Our industry brings so many people that had no idea what our industry was about and build so many lifelong skills for them to take if they stay in our industry, if they go elsewhere, right? All that skill building.
There's so much happening.
There's just so much happening.
You don't get that in traditional industry, other places. You know, it's like you're kind of, a lot of times you're just confined to your job, and it's hard to break out of that. Like, I don't feel like I had an advocate in my previous life, and you can't not have an advocate here, because we have such a gap of personnel. Like, back to what we were saying earlier, the generalist versus the specialist, or maybe that's not the right way to put it, but stacking your skill set. That's the thing, because we don't have enough people to, separate everyone into their little box and like, this is all you do and that's it. Like, you have to do everything. You have to.
You bring up such a good point in my previous, and I won't throw it under the bus, but yes.
Keep it going.
I was in a box. This is what I did.
Yep.
And then there was talk of like creating a team where you did a lot of other different things. I think I've been gone from there for 3 years. I think they're still having the same conversation.
Yeah.
And I come here, and just the amount of different things I have to be involved in. I'm not in a box.
Yeah.
And we often like try to figure out efficiency. Like, it would be more efficient to put somebody in a box, but at the same time, there's no way you can do that.
No.
There's no way, especially with how these projects go sometimes. They start, stop, go sideways.
Yes.
They do loop-de-loops, right? To have one person just
Module change. Right.
No, don't get me started on that one.
Yeah.
But just to have someone that's all they do. Maybe all they do is power studies, right? Like, you need flexibility in your workforce too, to be able to go with the flow of how the industry's going, how projects are developing, just how the business is growing.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are also picking up on a good point on just mentors. I was very lucky in my career that I found mentors that not only advocated for me early in my career, but also were willing to give me enough space to grow. Right? You have to find the right mentors to allow you to do that growth and try new things. And maybe you fail, maybe you fail miserably, but at least you tried something new and you learned something and you added some more skills to your skill stack.
And that is our segue to hydrogen, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Michael, we've talked a ton about you clearly know everything about renewables.
Yeah.
So.
That's not true. I only know maybe 5% of the knowledge out there, and I'm above average at it.
So let's get to that last percent of hydrogen. Now, I know you're not under an NDA with EE North America, and some of the things you guys are doing, but I think for our listeners, can you just talk about hydrogen? Can you talk about what you're seeing in the market, what is it like?
Yeah, what is hydrogen?
overview?
What is green hydrogen?
And not just green, like what there's types of hydrogen as well that just educating us on that as well.
So I think hydrogen's a really interesting space. I see it as where like solar was probably 20 to 30 years ago, where there's a lot of ideas of where hydrogen can go, and everyone's trying to figure out the right formula on how to execute on it.
Why is that happening right now, would you say? Like, what has changed
what's the driving
now
factor?
I think
versus 5-10 years ago?
I'll use something that Matt LeDuc over at Forum Mobility said a few years ago that I heard, and it's kind of stuck with me for a while. When you're thinking about clean tech projects, follow the regulations. And what I mean by that is, when the regulatory environment is opening up for an opportunity, that's kind of the perfect time to pursue that opportunity in that market, especially in clean tech. And I think from a federal level, there's been a lot of push to try to figure out, okay, we've figured out how to decarbonize electricity. How do we decarbonize the really hard to abate industries like industrial process, marine transport, ammonia production, right? Like how do we decarbonize those areas that you can't just say,
Does
hey,
aviation get a nod in there too?
aviation, yep, green SAF, e-fuels like e-gasoline, right? Like all of those different areas where you can't just have a solar panel. You can't just have a BESS system. You can't just have a wind turbine sitting there like producing electricity. That's a much more energy intensive process. And typically in those applications, something is moving, right? It's not stationary. And so to go back to the original point of like, what is green hydrogen? Green hydrogen is a minimally carbon intensive hydrogen or form of hydrogen. I think under the IRA Section 45V tax credit, they define it as 0.45 CO2 equivalent gases per kilogram of hydrogen, which if you look at like traditional hydrogen production, which is gray hydrogen from natural gas, it's at a much higher level than that. And so that's really where the incentives come from the regulatory standpoint, is that Section 45V tax credit. And that's really where we see our business going long term, as we see PPA prices continue to kind of fluctuate and come down over time. And we see that
What are PPA prices? I don't know what PPA means.
power purchase agreement.
purchase agreement, yeah.
So that's the contracted revenue side of any power plant, right? Any developer that's developing a project and wants to get financing, they have to have some type of contracted revenue for their production.
I have a follow-up question here. I want to ask just
go.
quickly, just while we're talking about PPAs and your work as a developer, you're seeing just a lot of the industry. What like the role of the utility long term, like with PPAs? Like, I mean, they historically made all the energy, but now private developers are making energy and they're relying on these PPAs.
So I think it's the utilities are going through a really interesting time as well. So there's been a lot of FERC reform recently, especially with the interconnection process. So where we operate in WEC, there's been a lot of reform to move from kind of, their previous process to more of a clusterized study process where the externalities of that facility interconnecting at any location is now being socialized among all of the projects in that area. So you have that going on the interconnection side, which I think will hopefully make the interconnection process easier and more equitable for all parties part of it. But then to your point on the generation side, a lot of the utilities have gone through ebbs and flows of having a deregulated generator unit or not having a deregulated generation unit, right? NextEra Energy is a perfect example, right? They have their regulated FP&L group that's all regulated, and then they have NextEra Energy Partners, which does all of their deregulated solar storage and everything else that they do. And so I think the utilities long term will continue to come to the developer community to continue to add generation to their system, especially on the renewable side, right? Colorado is a perfect example. Colorado had a renewable portfolio standard where they needed, I think it was about 50% of their generation by 2020 or 2021 to be renewables. They've already broken that earlier than that, and I think they're now at close to like, there's 30%, 30, 50%. Anyway, long story short, they broke that record in record time, right? Yeah. And so it's states continue to increase that. The generators and the utilities need to continue to add that generation to portfolio, so they'll continue to go out to the market to contract, especially in the regulated markets. I think also a lot of the corporate PPAs, right? Like I think you guys have probably seen the Brookfield Microsoft deal that was just signed a day or two ago. That's a huge deal. And like the corporates are still going to be going to the typical ISO markets to procure their electricity. But from a lot of the clients we've talked to, a lot of them are looking at different solutions than the traditional solar or wind PPA. They're looking at, hey, my data center has a load at 4 to 8 p.m. How do you serve that consistently, right? And they're asking more questions that really help them fit their energy load profile. When you have both of those pressures, the corporate guys wanting more innovative solutions, and then the regulatory environment incentivizing more renewable generation in those regulated utility markets, the utilities kind of have their hands tied a little bit where they have to continue to put out RFPs and to continue to procure generation resources in those markets to meet those demands. Utilities are very traditional type companies. And so they're very slow moving compared to a lot of the other types of companies in our industry. But I do think they do realize that, hey, we can procure really low cost electricity that's environmentally friendly. And there's some really interesting solutions coming on the horizon the next 10 years, especially around hydrogen and storage and some of the applications you can do with hydrogen, that I think they're a lot more open to those solutions, especially the forward-thinking utilities, than they were even just 5 years ago.
Sure. Thanks for that.
Sorry, I could go on forever for that. Yeah.
That could be a whole other discussion, but please continue your hydrogen talk.
So we've talked about green hydrogen, what green hydrogen is. We've kind of talked about the regulatory framework of, why is green hydrogen becoming so popular right now? And it's really because of those incentives as part of the IRA. I think additionally, what's really interesting in the hydrogen world is how it can augment your generation deployment strategy. And so the reason I started to kind of talk about PPAs in general is, if you are able to operate as not only a generator of electricity, but also the load source in the grid at the same time with those generation assets, there's a lot of really interesting opportunities that come from that. And so a lot of our peers that we're seeing in the industry have really invested heavily into hydrogen, not only for the tax incentives, but they can also see like, hey, if we're able to add load to the grid at the same time that we're able to add generation, and we're able to decarbonize the grid more efficiently with all of this hydrogen production, that's a really interesting business opportunity. And so we're seeing a lot of companies throughout the industry right now figuring out like, how do we partner with more industrial clients that are interested in hydrogen to support those efforts, either grid tied, behind the meter, lots of different types of solutions that we're seeing out there right now. And so I personally find it really exciting because how we're developing our company, especially in the US, being a fairly small developer in the US, but a large global brand, we're seeing a really different way to build the traditional developer. Like thinking about a lot of the questions that you guys brought up around reliability and availability and what products do you use, what partners do you work with, right? Like it's not a fight to the lowest common denominator, right? Getting to the lowest cost per watt. It's a question of how do I get to the lowest cost of production of hydrogen? And when you ask that question, your solution set is a lot different than the lowest cost per watt.
So go ahead, Bobby.
It's really the manufacturing of hydrogen that's driving, and then the use of hydrogen in all these other industries.
Yeah,
Pretty cool.
especially to abate the CO2 equivalent gases that are in those industries, right? And there's a lot of different applications that you can do, and we're working on a lot of those applications. I think I mentioned earlier, our company is working on CASO, which is the world's largest green e-methanol facility currently in Denmark. And we have very similar plans here in the US. And one of the projects we've publicly announced is our Port of Victoria project, which is another green e-methanol facility that's currently in development. And so that's kind of how we see our business long term, is someone who is more of a vertically integrated solutions provider for hard to abate industries, especially heavy industries.
What's the primary use for hydrogen right now as a product on the market?
So
like if you were building a renewable plant and it was fully integrated like this, like what would you do with your hydrogen after you
so traditionally it's been used in like heavy industry, right? There's been heavy industry, especially in South Texas where we do a lot of our work. There's been hydrogen pipelines all over South Texas for a long time. And so in industry, typically that's where we'd use like a pure form of hydrogen. And then also like vehicle transport. So like fuel cells and that type of stuff. Like you guys have probably seen the hydrogen powered cars. That's what we've also seen a lot of. I would say this though, like we don't see that as we see that as a stepping stone, right? We see that there's going to be a period of time where hydrogen production is very profitable and a lot of people are going to be able to do it and hopefully bring the overall cost of hydrogen down, because there's just going to be a large supply of hydrogen in the market as a whole. That being said, like what happens after that? That's the question we keep asking
Yeah.
is,
We have all this hydrogen.
we have all of this hydrogen, then what do you do with it?
Yeah.
And so like that's the solution. That's the work that we're working on right now.
Because I think, like we talked in our pre-show call, it's one of the biggest challenges is how do you transport it? What do you use a pipeline? Do you put it on a truck? And then what form are you transporting it in? Because ideally you'd want to transport it in the liquid form, or at least that's where it's the most energy dense. Like if you can use it in that form is for like decarbonizing shipping or rail transit or aviation, you almost have to use it in that form. Is that relatively correct?
So hydrogen, I mean, for most of the transport and storage options we've looked at, we've pretty much kept it gaseous. We haven't thought about liquefying it. But even in the gaseous form, because it's such a small not sure if it's compound or molecule. I'm going to use it. Compound? Is that? I was awful at chemistry. I got C's.
We'll say compound.
But as H2, right? As
Yeah.
H2,
We'll check it in post.
right. As H2 is so small in the atomic form, it's really hard to store. It's really hard to transport. And so most people that are looking at that, they need to think about like, okay, if I'm going to transport hydrogen, how am I going to do it? And what are my losses as I'm transporting it, right?
It's interesting, like what you're saying is like transmission lines. Which I think I was watching this TEDx video. You're transferring electrons versus transferring a molecule, which probably is like what you were saying is what needs to be done. Infrastructure for that.
Right. And there's a lot of groups, especially the hydrogen hubs that are doing it right now, that are looking at like, how do we build this infrastructure out, right?
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of plans in the work from all through the central part of the US to build a lot of that infrastructure. But even with that infrastructure, it doesn't solve the problem of if there's an oversupply of hydrogen, what do you do with it? And so like I think that's how we've thought about our business. It's like our business is not the business of producing electricity, producing hydrogen, or even producing any of the byproducts that you can do with hydrogen and carbon sequestration and, you know, all of that. It's how do you solve the problems for our clients?
Yep.
It comes back to what solutions can we provide to our clients that are easy, reliable, and cost effective to abate those industries of the CO2 that they produce into the atmosphere.
So, gentlemen, not to cut us short, we're just about at time. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Any final words you want to say to our dearly beloved listeners?
All I would say is that if you're ever interested in hydrogen or power to X, feel free to reach out at any time. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so if you shoot me a message on LinkedIn, I'm pretty good at responding. And I would just say that, you know, I think it's a really exciting time for our industry, and I think we need to have more conversations like we've had today to really talk about those issues that are out there and bring them to light. And yeah, it's just been a great time with you guys and appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for having me.
Thanks for
the
being
education.
here. Yeah.
Wonderful. We'll see you guys next time on the Sounds of Solar podcast. Make sure to leave us a review, share with your friends, do the like, share, whatever that thing is. What do they call it these days?
Subscribe.
Subscribe. Yeah, subscribe. Yes. Do that.
I-beams.
IBMs. We'll cap back here in post. All right.
Take care.